Today is the day that I can finally share this tutorial with you on how to make my granny square jumper. This is literally one of my favorite makes ever. I love making granny squares, so this was perfect, especially because I love wearing something colorful in the winter, and this is just the pop of color that you will need in your wardrobe. It's a great project to do over a longer period of time, especially when you're on the go a lot. Because the jumper is made out of like 56 squares, you can make the squares as and when you leave the house. If you're at work, you're on your lunch breaks, you're on the bus, you're on the train, wherever you're going. I would always just put a few little bits of scrap yarns in my bag and a crochet hook and make those squares. And with that being said, this is also the perfect project to use up all of your bits of scrap yarn that you have laying around. The way that this jumper is constructed also leaves room for a lot of modification, and you can sort of adapt it to how you want it to be. You will see in the portion of the video where I lay out how to join all the squares together that you can actually make this into just a vest, into a vest with a turtleneck, into a jumper without a turtleneck. So you can get quite creative with this as well. With this pattern, I also tried to combat two common issues that people have with these types of projects. The first one is weaving in the ends for your granny squares. Because you are changing colors every single row, you will have a lot of loose ends, and I made sure to really show you how to weave them in as you go, so you don't have to worry about weaving in a bunch of ends at the end of your project when you're so done and you just want to wear it, but also to weave them in securely so nothing comes undone in the wash or when you're wearing it out and about. The second thing I wanted to show you with this is how to join your squares, and it's a method called join as you go, and I found this so helpful to neatly join the squares and make it look like they're just like seamlessly added together. I'm going to run you through the materials, the sizing, and how to make it fit to your measurements, how to make a granny square, how to construct the jumper, and obviously also join your squares. I'll show you how to add some cuffs both for crocheting and for knitting, and then just the final finishing of blocking your piece. So I think let's just get straight into it.
For the squares, you will need 550 grams of acrylic yarn and 375 grams to join the squares and to make the arm cuffs. You will then need a 3mm crochet hook. This is variable, and you can also use other yarns such as cotton and mohair. The overall tutorial is laid out depending on your personal measurements, so you may need to adapt the amount of rows you create depending on your tension and the yarn you're using. For example, I created all of my squares using scrap yarns, so a lot of the yarn was very different from different companies with slightly different thicknesses. So you want to just aim for general similarity for all your squares to then match your body measurements. But we will now go through the exact sizing and measurements as well. We're going to start off by taking some body measurements, and you're going to want to measure the widest point of your upper body. For example, for me, this is my chest, and my chest measurements reached 37 inches. It could also be that your waist is the widest point of your body, and then you're going to want to just take that measurement instead. We're going to add 30% onto this measurement. That would just allow for this really slouchy and oversized feel for the final jumper. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate your body measurement plus 30%. So for me, this is 37 inches plus 30%, which gets me to 48.1 inches. I'm going to round that down to 48. So just remembering this final measurement, the overall width of the body of the jumper is made out of 8 squares. So we can actually figure out how large each of those squares is meant to be. So you're going to divide your final body measurement, which we just calculated. Like I've shown you, for me, I calculated 48. We're going to divide that by 8. So 48 divided by 8 gets me the number 6. This means that all of my squares are meant to be 6 inches wide in order for my jumper to get the perfect sizing. So in order to make the squares, generally each square is made out of 6 rows. But for this portion of the video, we're actually going to create 7 rows for the swatch square. The 7th row represents the row that is added later on when we're joining all the squares together. And for this row, I would recommend using the yarn that you are actually planning to use for the final jumper, just to ensure that everything is very accurate to the final result. So once you have your final square, you're going to measure the width of this. If the square meets the previously determined width, you are ready to just make the rest of the squares. Remember though to only crochet 6 rows for each square, and the 7th row will be added right at the end as the squares are joined together. In the case that your square is smaller than what you calculated, crochet another row and measure it again. If it is now too big, I would redo the entire square with just a larger hook. So if you crocheted this square with a 3mm hook, use a 3.5mm hook this time. You may just need to play around with different hook sizes and adding additional rows to get the right width, but you do want to eventually have your square reach the measurement that you previously calculated. If your square is bigger than it should be, remove one row and measure again. If it's now too small, redo the entire square with a smaller hook. So if you previously used the 3mm hook, use a 2.5mm hook this time. Have a little play around with this until you get to the correct sizing. So if you've never made a granny square before, let me show you how it's done. Start by making a slip knot and chaining 4. And you're then slip stitching into the very first chain. You will then chain 2. And you're going to yarn over and double crochet into the middle of the circle that you've just created. Do the same again, so you want to double crochet into the middle once again, and that creates your very first cluster of the granny square. You then chain 2, yarn over and do 3 more double crochets into that middle. Chain 2, do another 3 double crochets, chain 2 and another 3 double crochets. So you want to end up with 4 clusters of 3 double crochets for the initial row. You then slip stitch into the first double crochet or the chain 2 that you created right at the beginning. And this is where we're creating our first color change and where I'm going to show you how to weave in your ends as you go. So take your second color, create another slip knot and place that slip knot onto your hook as well. So you're then using that second color to pull through your slip stitch. And take both of those yarn ends and lay it over your current yarn. Then going to chain 2, and with that you've already secured your loose ends a little bit there, but we're going to take this even further to really make sure that everything is secure. So just put aside the second yarn tail and take the yarn tail from your first color and wrap it around the hole or the row you've just created. I like to wrap it around 2-3 times. You can use a crochet hook to just help you wrap it around, and then feed that yarn tail through your stitches. So you can see here I'm slowly feeding it through each of the 3 stitches, and then if you still have enough yarn left over, you can always wrap it around that second hole as well. Then take the yarn tail of your second colour and wrap it around again, and you're just going to continue with the second row. So you're going to double crochet 2, chain 2, double crochet 3, and you've created the first corner of your second row. Also, one thing to keep in mind is to always turn your work at the end of each row. If you're unsure whether to turn or not to turn, the first thing you're going to crochet in is a hole. If the first thing you have is 3 of those double crochets, you haven't turned your work yet and you need to turn it. So every time you start a new row, you're going to start by crocheting a cluster into a previous hole. So you're just going to continue doing your second row, and I'll show you another color swatch here. So once you've reached your final double crochet, you chain 1 and you slip into your previous double crochet, but you don't pull the yarn all the way through. You take your third color, create a slip knot and add that slip knot onto your crochet hook, and you're going to use your third color to finish off that slip stitch. Again, take all of your tail ends, this time it will be 3 ends, and just fold it over your working yarn, chain 2 and turn your work. And you're going to take the 2 tail ends of your previous yarn and wrap it around your second row. Just make sure you're wrapping it quite a few times. The more you wrap it, the less likely it will be for it to come undone. Take the tail end of your working yarn, wrap it over, and then you can continue with your double crochets and your third row. So you're basically just going to keep doing that until you've reached all of your rows. For the purpose of creating the swatch square, I'm creating a 7th row, but you want to generally aim for 6 rows for each square. Now that you've created all of of your squares, I'm going to show you how you can easily join them all together in one piece. So I made a little chart or illustration for you that you can follow along as you're joining, and what you want to do is follow the direction of the arrows, and whenever you get to the green stars, that is where you want to attach the sides of the body. And then when you've finished the body, you can start making your arms until you've reached the blue lines. That's where you can then directly attach the arms to the body. You're going to do that on both sides obviously, and then the same with the neck. You start making the neck, and then once you've reached the blue line, you can attach your squares right around the neckline as well. So hopefully this chart will help you just follow it along quite nicely, but let me show you how to actually join as you go, and I'll also show you how to join the different corners. You're just initially going to crochet around 2 of the sides, and once you've reached the corner of your second side, that's where you're going to start attaching your granny squares. So once you've reached this corner, you do 3 double crochets, chain 1, and this is where you're going to attach your first square. So grab your square and do 3 double crochets into the matching corner there. You're then going to chain 1, and you're going to slip stitch into the first hole of your previous square. And from there you're going to do 3 double crochets into the first hole of your second square, and that is basically it. So you're just going to do 3 double crochets, chain 1, slip stitch into the previous square, and just continue that pattern. So then when you reach the corner of your second square, you're going to do 3 double crochets, chain 1, and slip stitch into the corner hole of your previous square, chain 1, and do 3 double crochets into the same corner of your second square. And you can see that's where the 2 squares are perfectly added together there. And then you're just going to continue crocheting around your second square until it's time to add the next square, and so on and so forth. You will see in the chart there are a few sides where it's just straight crocheting. These are really simple, but when you're creating those sides, I'll show you how to connect those corners there as well. So once you've reached one of those corners, you're going to create the missing cluster of double crochets, chain 2, and you're going to slip stitch into the gap that you previously created when connecting your squares. Just going to slip stitch in there, chain 2, and do 3 double crochets in the next corner of the next square. So that is how you've connected the other side of the squares as well. When you then get to joining the next row of squares, you will have a sort of triple corner. And what you're going to do is chain 1, slip stitch into the corner of the square that you're currently attaching to, chain 1, and do 3 double crochets into the square that you're working on currently. So at these points, you are just connecting to the adjacent square of what you're currently working on. When you're then attaching the next square, you get to like a triple corner, and you're going to want to chain 1, slip stitch into the corner of the square that you're currently attaching to, and also slip stitch into the corner of the square that you're going to attach to. You do not need to slip stitch into the square that is diagonally to you. So at this point, you are just connecting to 2 of the squares. You do not need to connect to all 3 of them. And that's basically how it's done. So once you've connected all of your squares, you've added the arms, you've added your neck, you've basically finished the entire jumper. But I'm now going to show you how to add some cuffs, because the arms will be quite wide. So basically what you're going to do is to single crochet around the edge of your sleeve, but you're going to only single crochet into each hole, not into every stitch. So you can see here, I'm just single crocheting into the holes around the entire edge of my sleeve. This is just going to slim down the sleeve before you then slim it down even more with like a rib cuff. Once you get to the end of your row, you're then just going to slip stitch into the very first single crochet, and then if you are knitting your arm cuff, you can change out your crochet hook for your knitting needle. For mine, I used a 4mm needle, but really just comes down to how thick you want your ribbing to be. Obviously, a smaller needle is going to create a tighter ribbing, and a thicker needle is going to create a bit more of a thicker ribbing. So it really depends on how wide or how much hold you want your ribbing to give. Using your knitting needle, you're going to hook into every single crochet that you've created and just loop the yarn over your needle, which is going to create the stitches for your ribbing. And from there, you can just create your ribbing, whether that's a 1x1 or 2x2 or 2x1. That is completely up to you. I like to knit about 12 or 13 rows for my final ribbing, and you can see it really draws in that sleeve, which would otherwise be really, really wide. Now, if you want to crochet your ribbing, you're going to start with a slip knot, chain about 13 stitches. You can then hold that against your wrist just to double check that it is long enough. If you're happy with that length, chain one more and half double crochet into the second stitch from your crochet hook, and you're going to want to crochet into the back loops of your chain. Once you've reached the end of that first row, you're going to chain one, turn your work, and continue making half double crochets into the back loop only. That is then going to create this fake sort of ribbing detail, and once you feel like you've reached a good length, you can hold it against your wrist just to make sure that it is wide enough, and then you're going to slip stitch into the back loop of both sides in order to just connect them together. Then to add your cuff to your sleeve, I like to just place my cuff into the sleeve itself to make the seaming a bit easier. And all you're doing is slip stitching the sleeve to the cuff 1x1. Just as you're doing it, always check that you're seaming it evenly, as your cuff might be a bit smaller than the sleeve itself, just to draw it in together a bit. And there you go, you've added your crochet cuff to the sleeve. Then it's basically time to cut off all of your loose ends. This is where the previous weaving process will come in so handy, because you can just cut everything off without having to worry about unraveling. And then it's time to block or just simply hand wash your piece. With making granny squares, the tension can be quite tight and the overall result can look a bit funny. So you're gonna want to just hand wash your item. I like to just do this in the shower and use a big bucket. I fill it up with lukewarm water and add some fabric softener. I added way too much in the shot. You definitely do not need as much. Literally half of what I added is more than enough. Make sure your water is not too hot and it has a nice even temperature, and then you can add your jumper to this water. Make sure all the yarn is soaked and just give it a good nice squish, and then you can leave it to soak for about 20 to 30 minutes. You then want to try and drain most of the water in the jumper. You can actually see the water came out a bit murky. This is why it's so important to wash your pieces, because you do not know where that yarn has been previously to you using it. This is going to feel like a bit of a workout trying to get out all of that water, but the more you get out, the easier it will be to dry it later on. You can then dry your piece by squishing it out in a towel, but I'm lazy, so if you have access to a washing machine, I like to use the spin and drain cycle on mine. Yours might be called slightly different, but you basically just want to pop it on a very low spin cycle. You just want to be really careful with your piece. You don't want it spinning out of control in the washing machine, and then you can just let it air dry and you have your final piece. Honestly, if you've made it to this point, hats off to you, because this project takes a long time. You've literally just made 56 squares and connected them all together in one piece, so you can be so proud of yourself. I'm just obsessed with how baggy, slouchy and oversized this jumper is. You can wear it back to front, inside out, literally however you like. This is obviously the jumper I made for this tutorial specifically, but this is the jumper that I originally made, and you can see that this one does lay a lot looser and softer, and you can see how much the stitches have dropped over time. This just comes with washing it a few times, wearing it a few times. So if you feel like your jumper still feels quite squished together and tight, give it some time, let the stitches rest over time, a few gentle washes, a few gentle spin cycles, and your stitches will eventually just fall naturally into place. I honestly never thought I would make a second one of these jumpers, but here we are. I really enjoyed making this tutorial for you, and please let me know if you end up making it yourself. I would love to see your final results as well. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.